I suppose I work for a voluntary organisation, and I've been a designated officer and a trainer for 16 years, and in the Brothers of Charity we have been rolling this system out for 16 years, and I have to say I love my safeguarding team, and I like the fact that I have somebody to report to. There is oversight, and I feel really supported by it, because for the previous time to that, the truth is I was making stuff up. And, do you know, you didn't have anybody to go to. You didn't have, you know, you had internal audits and stuff, but I really feel a lot safer now with this system. I do see the flaws in the training as well. And, you know, I have my list here. But when I was listening to Michael Preston shoot, and he talking about human stories, relationship-based practice, humanity relationships, practitioners' knowledge and skills. And then he said not to be afraid of escalating. But I suppose I was just talking to Tim, we're stuck between HICWA and safeguarding sometimes. And it's not the fear of not to be afraid of escalating. It's kind of gone the other extreme. You know, you'd have a plan with your safeguarding team. It would be responsive to the people you know. And then sometimes the regulator comes in, picks up something in a file, and all hell breaks loose. And sometimes it's not in the best interest of the person, and it breaks down that human relationship that you've worked so hard at. Just Liam's point earlier on as well, because I don't think there was enough said about it. You know, you read the inquiries about the Brothers of Charity. I'm always reticent to mention Oris Attractor because we've all had inquiries, and I think they get mentioned a lot. And Winterbourne View, and then places. And when you read them inquiries, you see that the people didn't know that they were being mistreated. And I don't think there is enough education of the vulnerable people. And Michael spoke about putting stuff online. I think that kind of education could be put online. Everybody has access to computers and iPads, and I think we need to start way down there. You know, we're talking about, I know we have to train managers, but I think the way to keep people the safest is that they can recognise they're being mistreated themselves. Colleen asked me if there is anybody here that wasn't on the list, can they give their email address to her before they leave, because they're going to be sending out information to the people that were here today. So you will only get it if you were registered or on the list before, just to make sure you're on the list. I'm here, I suppose, to introduce the people this afternoon, and the first person that's going to come up and talk to you is Catherine White. She is the Director of Nursing in St Finbarr's Hospital in Cork, and she's won an award for this presentation, I was told earlier on. So, Catherine, if you want to come up.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my first time on live TV, so hello to everybody. I feel I'm on the Late Late Show, but not quite. Thanks very much for this invitation to Tim Hanley and the national team. We very much appreciate that. We have worked very closely with Tim in relation to this project, and we've always received his outstanding support. So thank you very much, Tim, for inviting us to present today. I'll try not to a death by PowerPoint, as Maggie has outlined earlier, especially after lunch when people are feeling rather full and well fed. So I'm basically going to talk through the presentation and give you the human story of our experience, because our experience in St Finbarr's Hospital could be anyone's experience in the morning, because we feel we are no different, or were no different to anybody else when we experienced what we experienced in relation to safeguarding. So we learned a lot of lessons, and we travelled a long, hard journey in the process, and I'm sharing that experience with you today. So I hope you find it useful. So just to give you some background in relation to St Finbarr's Hospital, we're in the HSE South Social Care Division. I manage 160 beds plus 4 TB beds on top of that. I have a residential and a rehabilitation services specifically for older adults over 65-year-olds, 89 residential beds, 71 rehabilitation beds, and both systems feed into each other. We are a very, very busy unit, and very much challenged by high dependency, whole-time equivalents, lower staffing levels than we would like at times, but cost containment and budget constraints. We deal with all of that on a daily basis. So our site is a 26-acre site. As you can see from the picture here, it's rather large. And my buildings are captured within the site. They're not all together. They're sporadic, and they're spread in different areas. So that, again, represents its challenges. And we have generally an old building, particularly in the residential side, which is governed by HIQA, and we're due to have a new community nursing unit built on site within the next 3 years, which will greatly support our efforts in relation to maintaining the HIQA standards. But at the moment, we operate from an older facility with shared communal wards, which are not ideal. So I suppose really in relation to our project and why did we implement a linked nurse practitioner, there are many reasons why we implemented it, but I joined St Finbarr's Hospital just over 2 years ago, August 2015, and I suppose before I took up the position, I was invited in and I signed the contract and all was well, and then I was sat down really in the Directors of Nursing office, and I was told that there was a safeguarding issue that needed to be addressed. So you feel the panic rising inside in you when you hear about this, and as a human being, you've two options, fight or flight, and clearly flight was not an option. I'd already signed the contract, so it was a case of how do we grin and bear it and how do we move forward. And I was a new Director of Nursing at the time to the organisation. I'd never worked there before. I didn't know anybody there, to be quite honest. I was getting to know the senior management team, and it was an entirely new experience, an entirely new challenge for me to take on the hospital, but then to take this on as well was very challenging indeed. So we really seriously had to consider where we were going and what we were going to do. And basically what happened in St Finbarr's Hospital, there was an incident, a safeguarding incident reported to HIQA from a relative of a resident who was in our care, and it wasn't reported through the normal channels of staff and management as one would expect. So HIQA relayed the contents of the conversation back to the senior management team, and it was then relayed back to us as Director of Nursing and as staff in St Finbarr's Hospital. So as a result of that, we had an unannounced HIQA inspection, and the HIQA inspection focused mainly on our safeguarding measures and what we were doing in relation to safeguarding, and that's really where the whole thing started. So that's what led to us developing a linked nurse practitioner. So I'll just go through the process as we move along and the impact, and I suppose very much the human journey, because when we talk about the human experience, we're not just talking about patients and residents and families, we're also talking about staff and the greater organisation, and it affects everybody in the organisation, which we found as we went along. So I suppose just going back to safeguarding and in relation to the national policy, we all know that vulnerable persons have a right to be protected against abuse. We're all very familiar with this definition. So as I say, I'm not going to dwell too much on the slides today. I want to concentrate on the human story. And I suppose looking at elder abuse and what does it mean to us, again, we have the HIQA definition, which is categorised into different aspects of abuse. And I suppose highlighted in that is the institutional care and restrictions imposed on the resident. So that's very much part of the project that we focused in on with our linked nurse practitioner. The World Health Organization uses a broader definition, and I suppose in many ways it goes deeper into the context of what is elder abuse. When we talk about a relationship with a resident and an expectation of trust which causes harm or distress to an older person. So that really incorporates a whole plethora of things, and you could literally put anything into that definition. It really doesn't confine it or substantiate it any further for us. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that the complexity attached to safeguarding and elder abuse is widely unplanned for in an ageing society. And although we had all the safeguarding measures in place, we had all the correct processes in place, we had our HSE policy in place, we had our mandatory training in place, and yet a safeguarding event occurred, which we'd completely unexpected, and it was very much unplanned for how we were going to react and how we were going to cope with it, and we just had to find a way. And I suppose just going back to what Martina said in her opening address, addressing the failures and how do we understand them and what was our choice in that scenario. We didn't want to be defeated by them. We wanted to move forward and we wanted to create something positive, and in creating something positive we developed the Linked Nurse Practitioner Programme. So what was the catalyst for change in Finbarr's? Again, as I've described, we had all the usual measures that everybody has, and then our serious event occurred, and that really was our catalyst for change. So we had to react and we had to do something about it. Our registration was on the line. We were told quite categorically by HIQA that we wouldn't be re-registered until this problem was resolved. As I mentioned to you earlier, we deal with a lot of old style buildings. The environment was always an issue with our HIQA inspection reports, but never anything else other than the environment. And we were being told at this point that the environment was very low on our list of priorities, that safeguarding came top of the list, and unless they could see substantial evidence that safeguarding measures had improved in St Finbarr's Hospital, we would not be re-registered, and that put 89 beds at risk, and that got everyone's attention. So this is what was said to us in our report, and this is going back to 2015. Significant improvements were required, most notably in safeguarding practices. Inspectors were not satisfied that staff demonstrated adequate awareness or responded appropriately to possible signs of abuse. So I suppose we all hear the bad news, and the media love to hear the bad stories. They never want to hear about the good stuff. So naturally, we attracted plenty of media attention, and we had local radio stations getting involved. We had the papers getting involved, and this was written on the Irish Examiner 2015. HICWA urges action on care abuse allegations. Centre for Elderly criticised in its report in the Irish Times again October 2015. This caused a lot of distress to staff. It caused a lot of distress to families who had other relatives on site, who spent their time ringing up and finding out, is my mum safe? Is my dad safe? What are we to do? What are our options here? And it created an enormous amount of distress right around the hospital. People were very upset, very distressed, from senior management all the way down to everybody on site. It created an enormous, I suppose, real uncertainty in the unit. And then, of course, our registration was at risk also. So we had to go and we had to discuss how we were going to deal with this and how we were going to manage it, and effectively how were we going to understand it. So knowledge seemed to be the key, and measuring knowledge seemed to be the key. And although we were implementing the mandatory training, as everybody does, we had no way of evaluating how that was being received by staff or how that was being put into practice. And I suppose in relation to today's presentations, you know, it was said earlier that knowledge does not lead to behaviour change, and that we have to engage in behaviour change. And that was very much at the kernel of the situation we were in. We had given staff the appropriate knowledge, but despite the fact that they had the correct knowledge, their behaviour wasn't implying that, and that's the situation we were left with. So it led us to identify a system of evaluating staff knowledge and how we were going to improve staff knowledge and practice in between the mandatory training. So we used the HSE change model to implement this project. I happened to be doing a master's at the time, so I chose this as my project, and that was the process we used. And that would be familiar to some of you, initiation, planning, implementation, mainstreaming. In an effort, I suppose, we looked back at the research just to see, you know, what was out there in relation to older person services and how people respond to abuse. And I suppose our concern was that abuse was happening and it wasn't being reported, and that really was the concern for us. It wasn't being reported by the manager and it wasn't being reported by the staff, and that was a real serious concern. So efforts to respond to elder abuse are often impeded by professionals' lack of knowledge concerning the recognition and identification of elder abuse and neglect. So we felt there was no malice and no intent in this, other than the fact that perhaps people didn't actually recognise that what was happening was wrong. Looking back at the research, the longer the nursing caregiving experience in residential care, the lower the identification of elder abuse. And I found that quite shocking because, you know, we work in organisations, we depend on the staff that are with us all the time, the ones that are most reliable, that you put in charge when you're on your week off or your days off or whatever. And, you know, the research will tell you that these are the people that will probably least likely to experience if there is a situation of elder abuse because of a culture or because of work practices that have evolved over time that just don't recognise it. And it's more likely to be somebody new in the organisation that's going to recognise if something isn't quite up to the level you'd like it to be at. The literature is unanimous in its findings that an increase in staff knowledge on what constitutes elder abuse substantially supports the protection of vulnerable older adults. So we knew where we were going. We knew we needed to enhance staff knowledge. We knew we needed to promote it in practice. So we did that by implementing a linked nurse practitioner project. And I suppose just to briefly describe it, what we did is we asked of each unit, and I have 9 units in total, between rehab and residential, we asked of the 9 units to ask staff nurses or anybody from staff nurse level upwards to be interested in becoming a linked nurse practitioner. And what we did was we trained them up on the train the trainer programme on safeguarding. We gave them the appropriate skills and knowledge, knowledge. And then we also gave them a CAMA tool, which is knowledge and management of abuse, a specific research tool, which I will go through with you in a minute. And that allowed us to identify the baseline knowledge of staff, and it allowed us to measure the baseline knowledge of staff. And it also allowed us, following the implementation of a linked nurse practitioner which supports staff on site in relation to elder abuse training, it allowed us to measure their knowledge before the training was implemented and after the training was implemented. And as a result of that, we received quite significant results. So the objective of the linked nurse practitioner was to review our current policy and procedures, which we were required to do by HICWA anyhow, develop a database of staff training needs, identify staff baseline knowledge using the CAMA tool. And again, this was mentioned earlier, how do we focus on a staff's baseline knowledge? And all of you will be involved in training staff through your Train the Trainer programme. They'll fill out a questionnaire or their booklet, and how do you know they're actually performing well in practice, or recognising abuse, or recognising elements that potentially could cause abuse in the future. And the CAMA tool helped us to do that by using it. So we were able to measure staff's baseline knowledge post HSE mandatory training. And as you can appreciate, at a time like this, when you've got these allegations of abuse, and when you have this negative media attention, there was an element of fear, and there was an element of panic, and there was a major training going on site. Everybody was being retrained again, just to make sure they absolutely knew what they were doing. So I think from August, when we got the report, in September, we had an enormous amount of mandatory training on site again. And the results are significant when we look at the baseline knowledge of staff. Even 6 weeks after receiving that training, the knowledge decay that had set in that much time, how much staff didn't quite understand, despite the fact that they had received the training. And that was a very important part of the project. So we were able to measure staff knowledge before the training, and we were able to measure staff knowledge afterwards. So the implementation, the CAMA tool, I suppose, really was a very important part of the linked nurse practitioner programme. I suppose it justified the development of a linked nurse practitioner, and it was able for us to measure exactly what people were proficient in and what they were not so proficient in. And the CAMA tool is broken down into different questionnaires, different case scenarios, different aspects of elder abuse. So it goes through the whole plethora of financial abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and so on. So we were able to clearly identify what people scored well in and what they didn't score so well in, and we were able to tailor our training to suit their needs. It was very much about each ward having a linked nurse practitioner to implement the CAMA tool and to have a face-to-face discussion with staff in a non-threatening manner, in a small group sessions, before report, after report, in an afternoon when you had an extra 10 minutes. If you had an extra concern about a particular relative or a particular patient, that you were able to discuss it with somebody, that there was no longer the fear of reporting. Because I think, there was an enormous sense of, enormous sense of failure if you feel you have to report something, whereas we were trying to take that element away from it. We were trying to take it to the fact that it should be an everyday discussion, that elder abuse is something, and protection of older people is something we should be doing every single day. So the process, again, developing the safeguarding linked nurse practitioner, they were specifically trained on the Train the Trainer programme. We have a Train the Trainer on site now to do that for us. They were given knowledge on the CAMA tool and how to use the CAMA tool, a very simple, easy to use tool. You can Google it if you want it, and if you can't find it on Google, by all means email me and I'll be more than happy to share it with you. It's a very simple, easy to use tool. It was designed specifically for residential services, which is fantastic, and in addition to that, it was designed for use. It's a very easy to understand language, and I'll go through some of the questions with you in a minute, but it's for everybody to understand. Every healthcare worker on site will find it easy enough and practical to use. So knowledge and management of abuse, the CAMA tool, it's a case vignette questionnaire designed specifically to assess staff knowledge on elder abuse, and as I said, it's appropriate for all grades of staff. It's a validated and recognised tool by Richardson et al. So if you were to, there's a whole series of questions, there's about 7 or 8 questions in each tool. CAMA tool A measures exactly the same knowledge as CAMA tool B. One is pre one is pre to get your baseline, the other one is post to get to where you are from. So they're both measuring the exact same thing, but obviously different case scenarios, different questions, because you then can't have somebody, I suppose, learning off the answer in the first instance and moving it on to the next one. So in question 1, I'm not going to go through all of this. You can read them for yourself, but it's a very simple question about you were helping with a patient and you identify bruising which is unexplained. What would you do? And I think any of us that are healthcare workers, and I know in my own nursing profession and working with elderly people and older people for so long, it's quite common that you would have come in contact perhaps with a person that had a bruise for whatever reason. And there was a time when we may not have investigated it fully, but now we're obliged to do that. And I suppose things that we have done since this has come to light is we've implemented bruising protocols, bruising policies, so that people have now a context and a format and a framework on which they can follow, so that if they identify a bruise that they can explain it, and if they can't explain it, then we have to question why is that bruise present in the first place. And again, this paper trail, I suppose, it safeguards everybody. It safeguards the staff as well, and it safeguards the patient. And I think that's very important because staff felt very threatened by this. I suppose the question then from Comma B, again, it's just another example, and it's actually on the wall there, which is quite timely. But it's just that, you know, somebody trying to get out. Before we would have thought nothing of locking a door and keeping somebody in, and now we realise, is it a form of abuse or is it not? And it's asking staff to question those kind of things. And these are all institutional measures, things that we would have taken no notice of 5-6 years ago, and which things that we really are starting to question now and identify with our own environments. The linked nurse practitioner networks in small groups, which is proven to have long-standing impact on developing professional practice. So it's all about developing relationships, creating relationships in a non-threatening environment. You have to appreciate that you're educating everybody, healthcare assistants, multitask attendants, staff nurses, your C&M group, and right across the board. And if a healthcare assistant is concerned about the behaviour of a nurse or the behaviour of a C&M too, then they have to have an appropriate channel on which to disclose or in which to be open and honest about their concerns. And the linked nurse practitioner creates that channel for them. And I suppose I'm looking in that I have 9 units, so I have 9 linked nurse practitioners. So if they're not comfortable talking about it in one unit, they might perhaps go to another unit and talk to them. But at least it gives them a format or a forum on which to consider what they might do if they are unsure about something or if they are concerned. It creates a transparent quality care environment where ethical principles are focused on the dignity and well-being of older people, where they live and how they are cared for. And I suppose, again, this goes back to the environment, and I suppose making safeguarding personal, which is very much in keeping with the linked nurse practitioner programme, and it very much brings into fore everything that has been discussed here on this session today. I suppose recognising sometimes that training alone is not enough, recognising that we need to link knowledge with actual practice, and recognising that we need to build capacity within our team. You know, it's all very well to train them and to give them the cert and to let them off about their business, but it takes an awful lot of courage for anyone to come forward and say, I'm not really sure about this, this doesn't sit right with me, it's been happening for a long time, I'm working in this unit for the last 5 years, and I've really reflected on my training and decided that this is not the appropriate way to go about doing X, Y and Z. It takes an awful lot of courage for somebody to come forward and discuss that with somebody else. So I think giving them a linked nurse practitioner gives them a sense of support. The linked nurse practitioner cultivates knowledge, and it stimulates an interest among caregivers in association with the older adult. And again, Michael eloquently described this. It's not all about doing to, it's doing with. And we have to include the older person in this, because we have to know the life experience of the older person, what they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with, if they're used to living in a shared communal facility, if they're not, if they'd rather be on their own, if they're being annoyed by another resident nearby who happens to be shouting. Whatever the case may be, we have to take all these things into consideration when looking at safeguarding and protecting our older people. The linked nurse practitioner moves us away from a reactive system to a proactive system. And we felt this was very important because HICWA is very much a reactive system. It's our regulator. We understand it has a purpose, but it gave us the reaction. And now we needed the proaction. We needed to see it, if we could turn it around and create something positive as opposed to focusing on the negative. And I suppose it's very easy to focus on the negative, and it's very easy to focus on the blame culture. Who's at fault? Is it the senior management team? Is it the director of nursing? Is it the trainers that didn't didn't train the people appropriately? Is it the staff themselves because they didn't understand, they didn't clearly articulate that they didn't understand? Who is to blame? And it's to move away from that blame culture. It's to try and, I suppose, take ownership of the situation ourselves. And that's one thing St. Finbarr's was very good at. We all felt very responsible and very accountable for what went wrong, and we all took ownership of it. And as a result of taking ownership of it, we developed this programme. So the Linked Nurse Practitioner, it demonstrates effectiveness in the need to develop new ways of thinking in protecting vulnerable older adults in residential care. So it's about the staff generating ideas, talking to the residents, talking to their relatives, identifying what really matters to them and generating new ways of thinking. It created a medium through which staff knowledge could be actively monitored and assessed using the CAMA as a measurement tool. And we have identified from the implementation of the LNP that using the CAMA tool, there was a 41% increase in staff knowledge. So I'll show you how that came about. We introduced the CAMA-A initially. This was 3 months post HSE mandatory training, bearing in mind that all our staff had now been urgently mandatory trained again because we weren't sure they got it the first time, so we made sure they were going to get it the second time as a safeguarding measure for ourselves. And within 3 months of post-mandatory training, these are the results that we got from the wards, and some of them are less than 40%. So you would expect that within 3 months of training, you would be getting at least 50% of your questions right. You would expect that you would be getting a bit more, if at all possible. But we found that the knowledge was quite poor, even after the implementation of mandatory training. So that was a huge concern. So we then set about the Linked Nurse Practitioner programme, went into each unit, and they had their small group sessions. They discussed their case scenarios using the CAMA tool. They went through, I suppose, their own situations at ward level, how they can improve their own practices at ward level. And 6 months later, we measured their knowledge again using CAMA tool B and post LNP intervention. And as you can see from the red, there was a significant increase in knowledge, and people had learned a lot in that much time, and they were really putting into practice what their knowledge was and really showing to us that they were effectively managing their workload. So I suppose just taking 2 as an example there, we picked 2 wards and there was an average increase of 41%, and that went right across the board really. There was a substantial increase with regards what people were understanding now and what they were putting into practice. So the impact on practice, we would say from the statistics that we gathered, there was a 300% increase initially in the alleged cases of abuse being reported. I suppose there was a huge fear that if we don't report everything, then we're at risk ourselves. So we had to, I suppose, work on that. That was a huge challenge for us as managers, and we really had to work with staff and support them in saying, you know, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate and so on. So I suppose the practice and development team worked a lot on that. We eliminated any fear of retribution. That was very important. So we did encourage staff to report everything. We did encourage staff to go to their Linked Nurse Practitioner. We did encourage staff to keep talking at ward level, because it's only through generation of discussion and creating relationships amongst yourselves that you really get to find out what the issues are. Reporting seen as best practice at all times. So we did encourage people to report. We did encourage open discussion and transparency. We did create a safe and secure environment where staff and patients could participate. So staff were involved, patients were involved, relatives were asked for their opinions, because bearing in mind they're very much involved as well, because they were listening to the media attention. Consistent support every day, not just once off training every 2 years. And I suppose I know it's every 3 years now. At the time, 2015, the mandatory was every 2 years. But now every 3 years, you know, the once off training, we really have to ask ourselves, is that enough? And, you know, I think we all know the answer to that at this stage. So the staff feedback on the programme, when we had implemented it, I suppose about 10 months into the programme, we looked for staff feedback. To have the programme on the ward brought issues to base, and these were the things we didn't think of as managers. This is the feedback we got from our staff, and I think this feedback is very important. So bringing issues back to ward level, staff found that very important, because you can talk about case scenarios in a classroom setting all day long, but it's until you bring it back to Mary or Johnny or Jimmy or the person that's at ward base that you really begin to understand, well, that's how Jimmy must have been feeling all these years when he was next to Mary, and Mary was always interfering with these things. So you are reminded of your surroundings, the residents, and the way you treat the residents becomes more real and more important than in the classroom. So you see the human aspect, you see the human experience, and you say, well, I'm not sure I'd be able to tolerate this if I was in this institution for very long, so maybe we shouldn't be expecting so-and-so to tolerate it either. We must do something about it. Small groups were very effective, and the staff felt that worked very well for them because, again, it was a non-threatening environment. It helped them to consider how I would deal with various situations if they occurred. Again, that wasn't very important to staff. The case studies and the CAMA tool, they found them very helpful. They're very insightful and easy to read, and I suppose they really are case scenarios that could happen any day in any given residential setting. So it really gave them a good insight on how to deal with day-to-day situations. The Link Nurse Practitioner is always on hand to answer our questions and to monitor our interaction with residents. So they kind of feel that was a link, a sense of support. Were they doing the right thing? Because they were beginning to question themselves and wonder, were they doing the right thing? And the Link Nurse Practitioner was able to give them the assurance, yes, we are doing everything we can to support the needs of that person. The Link Nurse Practitioner feedback, these were the courageous people that took the project on, and I'm given 5 minutes, so I'll speed it up a little bit, but these people really have to be commended because they took it on at a time of crisis and at a time when all eyes were focused on them, and it really was a hard challenge for them to take on. So for them it generated a lot of thought and discussion on the wards, and being a Link Nurse Practitioner made them feel more confident in speaking with other staff members, and they felt it was a positive experience for them. And as a Link Nurse Practitioner, they felt they had a sense of responsibility to lead by example. And again, that is a very important point. They really felt involved and part of the team. So moving forward, and I'm just going to slip through these because we've a lot of it discussed already. How do we recognise elder abuse as a once-off event, as something that could potentially occur every day, as a lifestyle choice? What do we view it as? And I think it's a case of viewing our own environment, viewing our own culture, viewing our own staff, and looking at our attitudes, our knowledge, as we've already highlighted, our skill, our culture, and our service user experience. And I think the service user experience is probably critical. How do our service users identify with us? How is their experience for them, and is there anything that we can do to improve that for them? Using a systematic approach, I think, is very important. We had very good HICWA reports prior to the one negative one. We were very compliant as far as HICWA were concerned. We got one negative report, and it put us into a complete and utter disarray. I can't explain to you the trauma it caused to people on site at the time. It was very stressful. And, had we looked at elder abuse as a standard functional thing rather than a once-off event, it would have probably made that a lot easier for us to cope with. There will always be an imbalance of power between residential centres and between the residents as beneficiaries and the staff as caregivers. That's always going to exist. It's never going to change in our lifetime and in the next generation, so we always have to take that into context. Dementia is a risk factor, as we know. Again, this is just a graphic illustration of reported cases. Amanda Phelan from University College Dublin has done an enormous amount of research on elder abuse, and she would say that the reported cases really are at the tip of the iceberg even today, because there is still that fear, and we have to eliminate that fear of reporting before people can have the courage to move forward. To conclude, and I'm trying to stick to time, where lessons learned for us, we learned that as service providers we need to harness the protection of vulnerable older adults by taking direct responsibility for the evaluation of staff training, and that's really what the LNP is about. It's about evaluating staff training. Depending on the 3-year mandatory HSE training programme for safeguarding, we feel it's not enough. If systems of education are not in place, we feel their staff need more support than that. It's not good enough to come out of a training session and not give them the support that they need at ward level. The impact of knowledge decay has to be recognised. It's all very well to say you've got your cert today, you're not due back to me for 3 years, but you have to understand there's going to be a level of knowledge decay between that and then, and that's very much where the Link Nurse Practitioner programme fits in. Thank you very much for your time.